only wish to have friends and stay with my brother.
Christ! You are extremely selfish! Die!
I'm 12 years old.
With the recent release of the Book of Bill and the absolutely gigantic rabbit hole of secrets and additions to the show's lore that came with it, check out my video on it if you're interested, Gravity Falls has experienced possibly the largest resurgence it has ever had this summer. Even nearly a decade after the show concluded, the show still regularly brings in new and returning fans. And with that, it naturally leads to many things about the show being discussed again in detail. And due to this recent Gravity Falls boom that doesn't seem to have slowed down yet, I think it's finally time for me to make a video that I've been thinking about for years. While we can all pretend that Gravity Falls is some 100% perfect show without any flaws whatsoever, but to be fair, like 90% of the time it is that. No, I am not biased, shut up. It did have a few hiccups here and there, even when executing a solid idea that gave a handful of people the wrong impression about whatever it was trying to say. Never enough to ruin the show or even a single episode overall, but just noticeable enough for people to start talking. And for years, the #1 complaint about Gravity Falls from some of the show's oldest fans, the one thing they pointed out about the show that they didn't like, was Mabel. You know, this girl. When I announced I would be making a video defending Mabel Pines, I got a surprising number of comments from people who were shocked that at one point she was hated by a loud vocal minority of the fandom. And I think that speaks volumes about how different people view Mabel nowadays compared to how people thought of her while the show was still running and in the few years after its conclusion. For years, there was a very loud and vocal minority of people who believed that Mabel Pines and how she was written was one of the very few flaws Gravity Falls had. It wasn't just a bunch of people vocalizing their dislike of a character because of superficial stuff like her being bubbly and hyperactive or just finding her annoying. People would legitimately argue that Mabel Pines was a poorly written character and that the show never called her out for being a bad person. While this evidently wasn't the opinion of the majority, I mean, you're still gonna find a lot of people that love Mabel to pieces, it wasn't uncommon to see arguments like these thrown around. Even people who didn't exactly hate Mabel and did not agree with all the things these people were saying still agreed with and passed around some of the points that people would use to criticize her. And I think a major turning point was with the release of the video Mabel is Terrible by creator CC West, an incredibly popular video essay at the time that repeated a lot of these talking points in far more detail, and even managed to convince a lot of people to hop on the Mabel hate train. And even years later, the impact of this video can still be felt throughout the community. However, with a massive wave of new fans picking up the show thanks to it being on Disney+, there's definitely been a shift of some kind, as I don't see people picking on Mabel as much as I used to. And thanks to this shift, I think it's finally time for me to say what I've been thinking for years now. Mabel isn't terrible, and I am tired of pretending she is. This is a video made with both love and spite. Love for Gravity Falls, as it's one of my favorite shows, and I would like to clear up a ton of misconceptions people have about a character I really like, and spite towards CC West, because his video has done a truly devastating amount of damage to Mabel's reputation since the show ended, and he really did convince a lot of people to believe that Mabel was in fact terrible. That guy's a f***ing predator. I'm not letting a predator who deleted his channel and his Mabel video influence the discussion about one of my favorite shows. Also, the arguments in that video were really bad, so there's that too. The vast majority of things people have been saying about Mabel for years are wrong. Not everything, obviously, but it is legitimately shocking how fast so many arguments about Mabel fall apart if you just rewatch the show with an open mind. I'm gonna be as fair as I can in this video, bringing up legitimate critiques people have had about Mabel before delving into many arguments people have used against Mabel for the past decade. I'm not looking to strawman anyone here. All arguments presented in this video are real and have been used against Mabel for ages. The Gravity Falls fandom is one of the few that I regularly interact with, and I've been in it since 2014. I have seen a lot of arguments get tossed around. I would also like to say that I will be discussing Lost Legends and the Book of Bill's additions to the canon, and specifically what they have to say about Mabel, but I will only be talking about them at the end in their own section. As well, yes, they are indeed canon. They were both released years after the show had already ended, and seek to provide additional context that isn't actually required in order to understand the show or its characters. For the main portion of this video, I will only be focusing on what is presented to us in the show itself, because bringing up two books that were made after the show had finished airing and using them as a gotcha moment is technically cheating. And it's not like I need Lost Legends or the Book of Bill to argue against what people have been saying about Mabel. Also, I will not be talking about Little Gift Shop of Horrors because this episode is not canon. Before we begin though, we need to go over some actual arguments against Mabel that I myself agree with. This won't take too long since there aren't that many of them, but I'd like to be as fair as possible here. When people criticize Mabel's actions, there are a good handful of episodes they tend to choose from. From what I've gathered, the most common episodes that are brought up when critiquing her are Time Traveler's Pig, The Deep End, Boys Crazy, Into the Bunker, Sock Opera, The Love God, The Last Mabelcorn, Dipper Mabel vs. the Future, and Weirdmageddon Part 2 Escape from Reality. And while I will be addressing all of these episodes in this video, I'll only be focusing on Boys Crazy, Into the Bunker, The Love God, and Escape from Reality here, as these are the only episodes of the show where I can find some common ground and agree with people's complaints. I will agree right off the bat that Mabel's actions are either very overtuned in these episodes, or, specifically in the case of Love God, the episode itself is shoddily written and Mabel ends up being a casualty of that. One of the biggest complaints regarding Mabel is that she's incredibly selfish and often marches to the beat of her own drum with very little regard for anyone else, and that while she will always learn individual lessons in the episode where she acknowledges she did something wrong, she will repeat the same selfish behavior in future episodes. Now, as a whole, this is a point I really don't agree with, and we'll get into that later, but for these episodes I can at least see where this complaint comes from. Boys Crazy is arguably Mabel at her worst across the entire show, she selfishly keeps the several times clones captive for her own benefits and then goes kinda nuts on Candy and Grenda for trying to intervene. Well, the whole point is that Mabel is in the wrong and she realizes this, apologizes to her friends and sets the boys free. Her behavior across the episode was pretty nasty, and I'll agree that I think it goes a few steps too far. In Into the Bunker, while she is trying to be Dipper's wingman and just wants him to confess to Wendy so he'll feel better and stop beating himself up about having a crush on her, her refusing to believe Dipper about there being a monster in the bunker and keeping the door shut was one of the few instances in the show where the writing is kinda stupid. While she does realize that she's screwed up and goes to try and rescue him and Wendy, this was still a pretty large misstep on her part, even though it was done from pure intentions. Now, The Love God in general is not a perfectly written episode, though I still think it's good just from the jokes and John DiMaggio alone. Mabel trying to play matchmaker with love potions, though she is called out on it, was not a good move, but she does realize this and tries to correct her mistake. There would be no complaints about Mabel's actions in this episode if it wasn't for the entire thing crumbling to pieces due to the ending. Robbie and Tambry being left drugged and in a relationship just because they look happy is a massive narrative and moral f**k-up that's more so a fault of the episode itself than Mabel as a character, but it still counts. And Wendy's friend group getting back together immediately removes any sort of consequences Mabel would have faced for what she did. As for Weirdmageddon Part 2, I will be heavily defending it later, so all I have to say is Dippy Fresh. I think the mere creation of Dippy Fresh is just way too cold, even if that's not what Mabel's intent was, and I greatly prefer the deleted scene where Dipper snaps his neck. Those are the main episodes where I can agree Mabel goes a bit too far. And while I said earlier I don't agree with this argument, I will agree that Mabel does repeat her selfish behavior. Despite learning individual lessons across the show and realizing that she's in the wrong by the end of an episode, she does have a repeating pattern of behavior that she doesn't definitively learn from until Weirdmageddon Part 2. While this was absolutely the intent with her character, and I don't believe it's bad writing, I do understand people's frustration. Most characters in Gravity Falls are kinda static, and their changes in behavior across the series are mostly subtle until the big story moments where we can see just how far they've come since the beginning. And with how much Dipper matures towards the end of the series, I can understand being annoyed about Mabel. It's still very much intentional, the whole point is that Dipper is trying to grow up too fast and Mabel doesn't want to grow up at all, but I do get it. That's the extent of me agreeing with the critiques about Mabel's behavior. She has a few brief moments across the number of episodes where she's out of pocket, and it's usually because the writing has a few hiccups and she ends up being collateral damage. While her actions aren't great, I do not believe for a second that they make her a bad person overall. And now we can get on to the main part of this video, which is defending Mabel Pines. I will be going down a list of commonly used arguments that criticize Mabel for being a bad, selfish person, and refuting them one by one. And again, none of these arguments are attempts at strawmanning the opposition or trying to paint them as incompetent. These are real critiques that people have levied against Mabel for years now. So without further ado, let's get into it. Mabel is selfish and never receives any consequences. Yes, Mabel does do selfish things throughout the show, that part is not in question at all, and we'll tackle the moments where she is selfish in a second. However, saying she's an all-around selfish person and a bad person is something else entirely. Firstly, the obvious and very short answer to this: she's a 12-year-old kid. Holding a 12-year-old to the same standards you would a fully grown and emotionally mature adult is quite literally the purest example of pitting a coughing baby versus a hydrogen bomb. Secondly, the actual answer you clicked on this video for. Throughout Gravity Falls, Mabel is shown to be an exceptionally caring and considerate person, and a lot of the things she wants to do are not actually born from selfish intentions. From small things like knitting everyone's sweaters during Weirdmageddon, to many plot important things such as 3, 2, 1, going out of her way to save Armando and bring him back to his family, try to change how the Mystery Shack is ran to benefit everyone working there, legitimately wanted to maintain a friendship with Gideon because she genuinely enjoyed his company and didn't want to turn down his creepy advances and hurt his feelings, immediately writing Gideon off after witnessing him trying to kill Dipper, constantly trying to be Dipper's wingman and give him advice on how to approach Wendy, willingly and calmly settles her feud with Pacifica and treats her with respect, trying her hardest to help Seuss find a partner he's happy with, literally going out of her way to try and make Robbie of all people happy when no one else around her cared at all for his well well-being. And I could go on and on, really. People really undersell how the majority of Mabel's actions, even if they go wrong, are born from her wanting to help people and make people happy. And sure, you can argue that her wanting everyone to be happy is somehow her also being selfish because it's all about what she wants or whatever, but we're not arguing in semantics today. Mabel is not an inherently selfish or a bad person. Doing some things that are selfish doesn't make you a completely selfish person, especially when you spend so much of your time trying to help others. And I think the main reason why a lot of people fail to see how caring Mabel actually is due to two things. Number one, people getting caught up on the moments where she does do something bad and selfish, which we'll discuss in a sec, and number two, Mabel's desires, whether for her own benefit or someone else, are often in opposition to Dipper's. Firstly, I can understand being hung up on the moments where Mabel does do something bad or selfish, but as previously said, these moments should not be enough to demonize her. No one's denying that Mabel can be self-focused sometimes, but I find it really silly that people hold a lot of this shit against her, especially when it comes to the no consequences thing. It's true that Mabel doesn't have to sacrifice as much as Dipper, but nearly every example people use to say Mabel gets away with everything consequence-free is entirely wrong, with the only exception being Love God due to the poor ending. In Boss Mabel, she makes a bet with Stan to see if her way of running his business is more successful than his, and eventually realizes that she has no idea what she's doing and has to handle the consequences, admitting that Stan's way of running the Mystery Shack was more effective. Her reasoning for making the bet with Stan wasn't entirely selfish, of course, as discussed earlier, but she does face the consequences for making such a short-sighted decision. The True Fake section of Bottomless Pit has her swap Stan's dentures for truth-telling teeth just to get him to stop lying, and that entire section is dedicated to showing the consequences of that decision, and forces her to lie to the police to stop Stan from being arrested. Boys Crazy has her going boys crazy, and while it is unpleasant to watch, she realizes that she was in the wrong and gives a heartfelt apology to Candy and Grenda. Into the Bunker's entire fiasco of her not believing Dipper about there being a monster with them is still followed up by an apology at the end of the episode, along with Mabel trying to cheer Dipper up after settling things with Wendy. Sock opera. While people like to claim Mabel doesn't receive any consequences here just because she dodged a bullet with Gabe being a weirdo, she still made the conscious decision to sabotage her entire performance she spent an entire week perfecting, knowing it would disappoint everyone in the audience before Gabe outed himself as a freak, all in order to save her brother. It's a big sacrifice and everyone just overlooks it because Gabe ended up being a freak, when that's not the important part here. She destroys all of her hard work and gets booed by an entire audience just to save her brother from Bill. Now you may have noticed I've excluded a good few episodes here, namely the main episodes people tend to use against Mabel, and they will be tackled shortly, just let me cook. The claim that Mabel always gets what she wants consequence-free is largely exaggerated, and more often than not she realizes she's done something wrong and apologizes for it. Her being selfish in later episodes does not invalidate this, and if you're gonna get on Mabel's case for having moments of selfishness, where is the same energy for Dipper exactly? This leads me to the second reason why people get hung up on Mabel being selfish. What a lot of people don't seem to acknowledge is that Dipper also does some very selfish things. And the reason why people have a hard time seeing that is because Dipper's desires are usually aligned with the audience's. Where you can argue all you want about which sibling is more or less selfish than the other, it doesn't matter. Dipper and Mabel both have selfish moments throughout the series, yet Mabel is the one who is constantly singled out for it, since Dipper's desires are usually aligned with the audience's desires, as he is usually the driving force and main focus of an episode's plot and does most of the mystery solving. And this isn't a dig at Dipper whatsoever, do not misunderstand. I love Dipper and Mabel, I think they're both excellent characters, but very rarely will you see Dipper held to the same standards as Mabel, and sometimes people will just straight up lie or misremember specific details in order to paint Dipper in a more positive light and make it look like Mabel's desires and her happiness are more important than his. Dipper often sacrifices his own desires and happiness for Mabel, and Mabel never sacrifices for him. This is a very common argument among Mabel critics, and I'm about to repeat a few things to really hammer this in for people. Yes, Dipper does sacrifice a lot more than Mabel does, and Mabel doesn't sacrifice as much for him. However, many people tend to overlook just how much of a fallacy this argument is. Mabel is very rarely in a position where she has to sacrifice something for Dipper, so this argument is already rigged in Dipper's favor. And even if it were down to how much the two sacrifice for each other, it shouldn't change much. Mabel very blatantly cares a lot about Dipper and would gladly risk her life to save him. You can argue that she should have had more moments where she sacrificed something for him to balance it all out, but that's all I can really agree on here. Another thing to mention is that this exact argument was used by Bill's Cypher in order to manipulate an emotionally vulnerable, sleep-deprived, and very stressed out Dipper, as a way to give him a fake ultimatum. A lot of people have tried arguing that Bill was right about Mabel in this scene and that Dipper making the deal in the first place means he feels the same way. But when you actually stop and analyze what's happening here, it becomes very apparent just how much Bill is talking out of his non-existent ass here to try and manipulate Dipper. First off, again, Dipper is on the clock in this scene as all the data from McGucket's laptop is about to be erased, and it doesn't help that he is incredibly sleep deprived and stressed out and still angry at Mabel for admittedly flaking out on him. Bill uses this to his advantage, and had Dipper not been in such a stressful situation with a number of factors at play, he would have never made this deal. Second, Bill is being very misleading here, and it's intentional. He's trying to manipulate Dipper while he's vulnerable. He shows scenes from Tourist Trapped, Time Traveler's Pig, and The Deep End. The example from Tourist Trapped is not an example of him sacrificing anything actually, he's just saving Mabel from the gnomes. And while Dipper is sacrificing something in Time Traveler's Pig and The Deep End, these are not good examples either, and the actual context for these sacrifices are incredibly important, and we'll get into that in a second. I find it deeply amusing that many people legitimately side with Bill Cipher in a scene where he is just blatantly making shit up to try and possess Dipper's body. The framing of this argument also makes it seem like Dipper's sacrifices are very one-sided when there's a ton of context missing. For example, the next argument. In Time Traveler's Pig, Dipper sacrifices his chances with Wendy just to make sure Mabel unites with Waddles. See, I told you I'd talk about the episodes that I left out earlier. This is a prime example of people ignoring how blatantly selfish Dipper can be at times. The conflict of this episode hinges on Mabel losing Waddles to Pacifica and Dipper trying to get with Wendy. At first, you may be inclined to think Dipper is sacrificing a date with Wendy in order to make sure Mabel is in a timeline where she gets to keep Waddles, but this is not true at all. Firstly, Mabel basically saved Waddles from being sold to someone else and eaten. Yeah, a lot of people miss that part. The pigs are literally being sold to be eaten. She's handed a knife and fork after winning Waddles. Secondly, her wanting to keep Waddles against what Dipper wants is not at all selfish or unreasonable, and that's because Dipper has no chances with Wendy. They make it very clear that she is too old for him even before Into the Bunker, and that there is no scenario where she'll suddenly start dating him. The only benefit of the timeline where Dipper wins the stuffed animal for Wendy is that Robbie doesn't ask her out because Robbie is a f***ing loser. The only person being selfish in this episode is Dipper. He steals Blendin's time tape to travel back in time multiple times to try and find a perfect scenario where he doesn't hit Wendy in the eye on accident and wins her a stuffed animal, all because he thinks he has a shot with her after this, which he doesn't. And since Mabel was crucial to this plan working, which side note she willingly puts getting Waddles aside to help him with, she loses Waddles to Pacifica. And I don't think I need to tell you that Pacifica Northwest is not interested in keeping a pig as a pet. Mabel wanting Waddles back is perfectly reasonable, and Dipper isn't really sacrificing anything here. I guess the shame of accidentally injuring Wendy is one thing, but she clearly never held it against him even in the same episode. People use this as an example of Mabel being selfish and Dipper sacrificing something for her, when in reality it's the complete opposite. Mabel unknowingly sacrifices Waddles to help Dipper try and score a date with Wendy that will never happen, and is understandably upset. Dipper is in the wrong and he realizes this and fixes his mistake. In The Deep End, Dipper sacrifices his job at the pool in order to make Mabel happy by saving Mermando. Once again, this is another example of Dipper being the selfish one and not Mabel. He becomes a lifeguard at the pool specifically because Wendy is also a lifeguard and plans on hanging out with her all summer. If you rewatch season 1, you'll realize that Dipper has a lot of selfish moments relating to his crush on Wendy. Wendy is not interested in Dipper, and they make it very clear that there's no chance of her dating him because she's too old for him. Dipper even acknowledges this fact himself at the end of Double Dipper. There's nothing wrong with Dipper having a childhood crush, but many episodes throughout season 1 consist of him doing something short-sighted and selfish because of his crush on Wendy, and eventually doing the right thing. Or in the case of Boys Crazy, not even doing that. This isn't a criticism of Dipper at all, but I want to highlight that a pretty good chunk of season 1's episodes have him doing something selfish because of his crush on Wendy, and that there's a serious double standard here. Trying to say Mabel is selfish for trying to save Mermando's life and getting back to his family safely is certainly an interesting take to have. Dipper is reluctant to hand over the megaphone because it will get him fired from his job that he only has because he wants to hang out with his unattainable crush, when Mermando needs it in order to call out to his family because of his damaged vocal cords. Mabel may have done all this for Mermando because she initially had a crush on him, but that's incredibly reductive. She cares about Mermando and saves him from the pool, fully aware that she will likely never see him again. Mabel is not being selfish in this episode. Dipper was driven only by his desire to get with Wendy and eventually does the right thing. In Sock Opera, Mabel hesitates to save Dipper and almost gives the journal to Bill. I can see where people come from with this point, but this is where I'm gonna have to cash in the "she's 12 years old" card, because Bill is basically doing what he did to Dipper earlier in the episode, cornering them when they're in an emotionally vulnerable position and bullshitting to try and manipulate them. Mabel is completely against giving Bill the book, but Bill has the upper hand here. He could literally drop Mabel from this height at a moment's notice, which would also ruin the play that she worked so hard on. It's a very distressing situation for a girl her rage to be in, especially when she's staring down a f***ing demon in the body of her brother. While her almost giving Bill the journal is bad, the most important part of this is that she snaps out of this and decides then and there that she's gonna sacrifice her hard work for her brother's safety, all the while dragging Bill down with her and kicking his ass. Everything about Dipper and Mabel versus the future. Ooh, man, there's a lot to cover here. There are so many things that people do not understand about this episode and Mabel's actions towards the end. I'll leave the complaint of her supposedly causing Wyrmrgeddon for its own section, because it's wrong. For now, I want to focus on what people are angry at Mabel for in this episode. What people will tell you is that Mabel is being incredibly selfish and unreasonable, and her lashing out at Dipper for valuing his future and taking on Ford's apprenticeship is a bad thing. There is so much wrong with how critics of Mabel tend to view this episode, so let's start with the obvious. Mabel has just had an incredibly bad day. What started out as her trying to plan her and Dipper's birthday party eventually devolved into a string of gut punches and disappointments. Her entire perception and excitement about going to high school is shattered in front of her, making her seriously worry about what the future has in store for her. Candy and Grenda, her two best friends, are not only unable to come to her birthday party, but won't even be around to say goodbye to her when she leaves Gravity Falls. The best summer of her life is ending soon and she doesn't want to grow up. And to add further insult to injury, she overhears Dipper, her brother, one of the most important people in her life and the person she thought she'd always have by her side through thick and thin, taking on an apprenticeship from Stanford that, while yes would give Dipper a promising education, being tutored by someone he greatly admires and sees as a hero, would mean he stays in Gravity Falls for good, unable to grow up alongside Mabel. Couple all of this with the obvious fact of, say it with me everyone, she's 12 years old, and suddenly Mabel's reaction here seems very understandable. While it's obviously wrong and selfish for her to be mad at Dipper for caring about his future and doing what he wants, the entire episode has been building up to Mabel finally breaking. Straight up, if you get mad at Mabel for her reaction here, I don't know what to say. Frustration is one thing, but acting like this isn't a completely normal and understandable reaction for a 12-year-old girl to have after having her hopes and dreams kicked down for an entire day is certainly a take. Then there's the whole debate about Dipper taking Ford's apprenticeship. This is something I'll repeat when we talk about Wyrmrgeddon Part 2, but many people don't get the point of Dipper's apprenticeship, and there's a lot of moving parts to it. Across the entire series, Dipper is trying to grow up too fast, while Mabel doesn't want to grow up at all. This offer from Ford would allow Dipper to basically cheat and skip out on growing up and experiencing his teen years, the most important and formative years of a person's life as they enter adulthood, and most importantly, he wouldn't be growing up alongside his sister. It's a very tempting deal that promises good things for Dipper's future, but it isn't the right option. Then there's also the fact that Stanford, as much as I love him, is very biased against siblinghood due to his past with Stanley. In fact, across the entire episode, and especially when he's offering the apprenticeship to Dipper, Ford is basically projecting his situation with Stan onto Dipper and Mabel. Heck, even at the end of Dungeons and More Dungeons, when he tells Dipper about the rift, he's so distrustful of his own family that he tells Dipper not to tell anyone about it, including Mabel.
We've never really been apart before.
And isn't it suffocating? Dipper, can you honestly tell me you never felt like you were meant for something more?
He tries to convince Dipper that he doesn't need Mabel, that she'll be fine without him and that he's destined for greatness. He doesn't understand the bond that Dipper and Mabel have and just sees himself in Stanley when they were younger. What Ford is offering Dipper is a deal that will rob him of so many important and life-changing experiences as he gets older, just so that he can skip the process of growing up, all the while leaving his sister to grow up without him and causing a rift between them. To add more to this, if you watch the commentary on Dipper and Mabel vs. the future, you'll learn that Mabel overhearing Dipper being given a tempting offer that would have left her behind actually came from a real experience creator Alex Hirsch had with his sister Ariel. It wasn't as life-changing as an apprenticeship with one of the smartest people alive, it was just a high school improv team that wanted to recruit Alex and leave Ariel behind, but the gist of it is that Alex didn't want to abandon Ariel and refused, and eventually the team that wanted to recruit him fell apart due to clashing egos. The point is that this deal is bogus, it's too good to be true, and while we don't know what exactly would have happened if Dipper took Ford's apprenticeship, Alex says during the commentary that things likely wouldn't have gone well.
The song and dance that he's giving Dipper right now is the exact song and dance that he gave McGucket. Dipper is a smart kid, but Ford's projecting. Ford loves Dipper because he sees someone who will tell him yes to everything. If Dipper had taken Ford's apprenticeship, because I know there are some fans that are like, oh, this is a great offer. Dipper should just become a mystery hunter for the rest of his life, not go to high school, not go to college, not be around kids his age. Like, Dipper probably would have gone the way of McGucket.
Right.
Like, turned into kind of insane, paranoid hermit with no friends, you know, like, just kind of losing his mind. It's a seductive offer, but ultimately, Dipper needs to learn not to try to grow up too fast.
Dipper himself comes to this conclusion in Wyrmrgeddon Part 2. It wasn't him trying to appease Mabel and throwing away a promising future. He understood that the deal was too good to be true and that he was trying to grow up too fast and making his life worse as a result, on top of leaving his sister behind. While Mabel not wanting Dipper to grow up without her is selfish, her meltdown was completely understandable, and Dipper's deal with Ford is not the gold ticket that a lot of people seem to think it is. Mabel was responsible for Weirdmageddon. This argument really gets under my skin because it places the blame for the entire apocalypse on Mabel's shoulders alone when there were so many factors at play. Yes, Mabel gave Bill the rift which caused Weirdmageddon, but to say all of this was Mabel's fault is a massive exaggeration, and I truly believe anyone who makes this point is arguing in bad faith. Firstly, the obvious. Mabel was tricked by Bill when she was emotionally vulnerable. This scene actually mirrors Dipper's deal with Bill from Sock Opera, where if it was under any other circumstance, these two would have never made a deal with Bill ever. Mabel just had one of the most distressing days of her life and just ran away from her brother in tears. She is not in an emotionally stable position. Secondly, Bill possesses Blendin, a time traveler that Dipper and Mabel are on good terms with, and bullshits her about a time bubble that prevents time from going forward and can extend her summer for as long as she pleases. To Mabel, knowing this guy dabbles in time-related stuff and her currently being in an emotionally vulnerable position, it would stand to reason that he would have a perfectly legitimate and non-evil or harmful way for her to have a little more summer. She has no idea that the time bubble Blendin is talking about isn't actually a thing, and definitely has no idea that it's actually a prison bubble designed to give her anything she desires so that she never leaves. Thirdly, while her giving away the rift knowing that it belongs to Ford is bad, I once again need to stress that she is not in a good state of mind and that Blendin has told her that it was a very small thing that Ford wouldn't even know went missing. Ford never told anyone besides Dipper about the rift and its importance and instructed Dipper to do the same. So Mabel had no way of knowing how important the rift was because to her it just looks like an odd looking snow globe. And that leads me on to my fourth point. None of this would have happened if Stanford trusted his family. If Mabel was told about the rift and its importance, then she wouldn't have given it away. And there really was no harm in telling her or even Stanley about the rift's existence. But because Ford has massive trust issues relating to family, he refused to let anyone other than Dipper know because he just sees Dipper and Mabel as himself and Stanley as kids, and doesn't want family to screw things up for him again. This fear of his is ironically what leads to Weirdmageddon anyway. Ford's own paranoia and distrust of his family led to the exact outcome he was looking to prevent. This isn't bad writing, it's actually really good writing, but almost no one criticizing Mabel acknowledges this and just blames Mabel for Weirdmageddon happening anyway. I cannot stand it when people blame Mabel, because while her giving Bill the rift was a bad and selfish decision, her emotional state, Bill's manipulation and choice of person to possess, coupled with Ford's complete inability to trust his own family, was the perfect storm for Bill to make his move in. No, Mabel was not solely responsible for Weirdmageddon, and there were a lot of factors that led to it happening. Everything about Weirdmageddon Part 2 Escape from Reality. This hopefully shouldn't take nearly as long to explain as Dipper Mabel vs. the Future. I've heard some people argue that Mabel goofing around in Mabelland while the apocalypse is happening outside is a bad thing and that the entire place is emblematic of the selfish parts of her character, completely forgetting that she's trapped inside of a prison that is specifically designed to let people indulge in their fantasies. Bill even says it's not easy to break free from the bubble's grasp, and we see that when Wendy and Seuss get distracted. Dipper has to willingly look away from whatever Mabel is about to show him so he doesn't fall for the bubble's tricks, and he still almost falls for its temptations with the fake Wendy that asks him out. If this was season 1 Dipper, I think he probably would have fallen for this. I think getting on Mabel's case for being manipulated by the bubble is a little iffy considering no one else in the episode receives that sort of flack. Not to mention, Mabel wants her friends to stay here and to keep them safe. The first thing she does is clean them up and heal their wounds and just wants them to be comfortable. She sees Mabelland as a safe place from the harshness of reality, and while she definitely indulges in her own fantasies, I mean just look at the damn place, she still cares a great deal about her friends and her brother. Mabel was brought here after one of the worst days of her life, and it let her hide away from the reality that just treated her so harshly and was forcing her to grow up. I find it hard to get mad at her for creating Mabelland. She's a scared kid, she's terrified of growing up and facing reality. Anyone getting mad at Mabel for staying in Mabelland not only completely forgets that it's a prison, but that Mabel is currently at her most vulnerable here. Now onto the main thing people have an issue with. The entire court case scene is a little extreme on paper, but I'll admit, but I think it does its job extremely well, showing Dipper and Mabel reconciling and showing that throughout their lives they have always been there for each other. It's also here that Dipper tells Mabel he's not taking Ford's apprenticeship and wants to grow up with her. To repeat what I said previously, Dipper is not throwing away the apprenticeship to appease Mabel. He's not sacrificing anything here. He realizes just how bad the apprenticeship would be for him and what it would be robbing him of. He wants to grow up with his sister. They both realize they can grow up and make it through high school together. That's about all I have to say for Weirdmageddon Part 2, honestly. A lot of people's frustration towards this in Dipper Mabel vs. the Future mostly surrounds Mabel's reaction to Dipper taking the apprenticeship and the concept of the apprenticeship in general. I thought the show was pretty clear with everything regarding it, but I guess it probably could have done with a little more to avoid all of this. Mabel constantly teases and makes fun of Dipper. You guys might be thinking of making this one up, but no, seriously, people do have a problem with Mabel teasing Dipper, and it actually contributes a lot to people not liking her and finding her annoying. I seriously don't get this at all. Like, even in the original Mabel is Terrible video, CC West was bringing up the blackmail line from the deep end, which was so obviously a joke that I was shocked anyone took that point seriously. It just feels like people grasping at straws to try and call Mabel a bad person. Even when she goes overboard on the teasing, like in Little Dipper, it's only because Dipper did the same thing and she was just reveling in the fact that she found something she was winning at with the whole height thing. And at the end of the day, it's just sibling teasing. It doesn't make her a bad person. I'm the oldest out of 4 siblings, and while one of us is still young and learning to talk, I still tease my younger brother and sister, and they do the same. It's perfectly normal. It's not as if Dipper never does anything back.
Love! Oh, hey, what's that?
Huh?
The last Mabel corn was the perfect opportunity to call Mabel out, yet it never happens. Given that a lot of points against Mabel are so widespread, yet are either completely false or exaggerated, people get disappointed with the last Mabel corn for focusing so much on whether or not Mabel is a good person and not calling her out for being this horrible, selfish person. To be blunt, these people are coping. The point of the last Mabel corn is not to call Mabel out or pretend that she's a good person with no flaws. It's about Mabel recognizing that she's not a pure, good-hearted person and instead embracing her imperfections. She spends the entire episode trying to do good deeds to prove she's pure of heart, but by the end, when she realizes that unicorns are the actual worst, she literally beats them up until they give her what she wants. The episode doesn't pretend that Mabel is a pure-hearted person. I mean, they show her punching a unicorn in the fucking face, for God's sake, and even when Ford tells her she's a good person for protecting her family at the end of the episode, she interjects. Mabel is not perfect, and she realizes that and embraces it in this episode. It's not a black and white Mabel is a good person or Mabel is a bad person. She's just flawed, like most people. The episode does call out the things she does that are bad, but they don't use it to definitively call her a bad person because that's not how it f***ing works. Mabel never learns from her mistakes. She does. She does. The overall selfishness is not sorted out until Wyrmageddon Part 2, but she does learn from her mistakes and apologizes to people. If you've watched this video up until now and still believe this, I don't know what to say. So now I'm going to talk about Lost Legends in the Book of Bill. I wanted to leave this separate because, as I said at the start of the video, using any and all additions to the show as canon that are found in external media released after the show ended is technically cheating. All these books do for Mabel is provide additional context for her actions that aren't needed to understand or defend her character if you just watch the show and nothing else. The Lost Legends comic, Don't Dimension It, feels like Alex Hirsch saw all the critiques towards Mabel online and decided to address it in a follow-up comic set after Bill had been defeated. While I do really enjoy the comic, I think it's probably the weakest story in Lost Legends, because all it really amounts to is Alex Hirsch taking the point and a hammer and bashing it into people's skulls until they recover their media literacy. It very blatantly shows that Mabel has learned her lesson and grown after the events of Wyrmageddon Part 2, and directly addresses the times where she was selfish. And honestly, I think they went a little too far and overcorrected on a couple of things. It feels like a comic that really wants to please people who think Mabel is an incredibly selfish and awful person, because despite Mabel not being nearly as selfish as people say she is, the comic kinda treats it like that. Still though, getting a direct and heartfelt apology from Mabel to Dipper was pretty great, and I think it's a well-written addendum at the very least. A decent response to criticism thrown at Mabel over the years. Now, the Book of Bill is where things get interesting, and if you've read it, you probably know exactly what I'm referring to. The reveal that Dipper has frequent bad dreams about the argument he heard his parents having, suggesting that they were going through a rough spot and possibly splitting up, revealing that the whole reason the kids were sent to Gravity Falls for the summer was so that they weren't around to see them like that. This adds a ton of weight to Mabel's reaction to Dipper's apprenticeship, possibly having to go back to her broken home without her brother, and it makes Mabel Land as a concept far more heartbreaking on a rewatch. While these are both canon additions, I don't think people should be bringing them up in discussions about Mabel's behavior or if you're trying to defend her from criticism. When people criticize Mabel, they're directing their critiques at how she is written in the original show that ran from 2012 to 2016. While it's great to get some additional context that changes how we view the show on a rewatch, using them to defend Mabel's actions in the show is not very fair, as it's unlikely any of this was planned from the start or that the show was written with these in mind. If they were, the show likely would have hinted at it in some way. And now we're at the end of this very long rant defending a character I really like from the show that ended nearly 10 years ago. I'm pretty happy that the new wave of fans watching the show don't seem to share the same sentiment about Mabel that people had while it was still airing. Even if you dislike Mabel or find her annoying, I think you can agree that the hate goes way too far, and a lot of things that have been said about Mabel are just blatantly untrue or exaggerated to sound much worse than they actually are. I maintain that Gravity Falls is one of the best shows I've ever watched, and it's one of the most tightly written cartoons ever, but I think a lot of problems with Mabel just boil down to the show not being entirely clear on some things and in rare cases actually screwing up. I can agree that Mabel can go too far at times, and I 100% understand people being frustrated by those moments. However, to completely demonize and act like this 12-year-old kid is an entirely selfish and awful person over what literally amounts to a handful of screw-ups and a ton of exaggerated outrage towards moments where she isn't even in the wrong is just insane to me. Mabel regularly demonstrates she's one of the most caring characters in Gravity Falls, and after doing my yearly rewatch of the show for this summer, I took a mental note of her good and bad qualities as I went through each episode. I truly do not believe for a second that the minuscule amount of actually bad, not exaggerated stuff that she does can even begin to outweigh her positives, and I felt now is probably the best time to make a video like this. I find it ridiculous that so many bad faith takes about Mabel still exist to this day, and that the original video that turned so many people into Mabel haters was a poorly written essay made by a predator. I think it's great that a lot of people are realizing that a lot of what's been said about Mabel is bullshit. If you still dislike Mabel, then that's totally fine, but there's a big difference between disliking a character and saying things that just aren't true about them or saying they're poorly written. I hope at the very least this video was able to help you realize that. Anyway, that's the end of the video. Play Yakuza or something.